Well, hello, hello. Hope everybody is doing well. This is our August rendition of the Too Sexy for DNN and Octane meetup. Relatively new meetup, still kind of in the formative stages. And we've got a lot of people joining here as we're getting started here. So I'll be kind of constantly letting people in for that. And let me go ahead and share my screen. We're trying a different time this month. Typically, we're trying to do it later in the day on the eastern coast of the U.S. On the first Friday of each month, but we're trying a different day and a different time this month to try to accommodate Daniel Mettler and his team. So Daniel's here today to present. So looking forward to that in a few minutes. So thank you for that. I'm glad you're able to join. Hopefully we have found a time that's a little bit more accommodating for you guys because you're what, 6 hours ahead, right? You're 5 p.m. there. So it's the end of your day, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the end of the day, if there's an end of the day.
True that. True that. Well, welcome everybody for joining us online. This is also being recorded, so we'll post it onto the YouTube channel after the fact. If it's cooperating today, a lot of times it doesn't cooperate right after right after the video renders, but eventually, usually within the next day or so, we got it up there. The worst case scenario. So this should be some great content. First of all, let me see. Am I sharing the correct screen? I should ask myself. Okay, yep, I'm doing that. So you should see the meetup here. Just a few random things for before we get into the main presentation, because we will try to keep this to the hour best as possible here to respect everybody's time. But just a few. And I'm sorry, I'm getting pinged left and right to let people in. There's so many people joining us. That's awesome. So it's good to see everybody. We've had quite a bit that's happened since the last time we did a meetup. I think the last actual meetup we had was in June, and we ended up having to skip July for various reasons, but one of which was trying to find a new time slot to try to accommodate the Too Sexy team over there as well. So really, really glad that worked out good. But I need to really just pull up a couple of things and see what all's been going on since the last time. And Daniel, feel free to chime in if there's something that you would like to point out that I miss here. But one of the first things I probably would do is go to GitHub. You can go to toosexy.org, click on the download button over here and kind of get to GitHub, their GitHub repo. And I would typically go there and just kind of look at the releases by date and see what all has been done, because let's see, as of the last meetup, see, April. Okay, yeah, so May. Okay, so as of the last meetup, we did have Too Sexy 16.1, the LTS version, and then since then there's been it's really a minor release semantically, but really a major as far as I understand it, with a lot of the changes, because some things had to be kind of re-architected a bit and shifted around. So I don't know if you have any highlights on that, Daniel, that you would like to just point out to people that may not be aware of this new release. Now I know it's not marked as LTS yet as well, so just want to kind of put that caveat in there, but we are using this on several production sites already.
Yeah. So I think, let's say internally, I'm gonna be showing some stuff later on, but I think one of the most, let's say, hidden parts that are kind of important is that we moved to .NET 7 for the Octane release. And of course, moving to a new .NET always means a new entity framework. It means fixing a few things, because with Octane 4, yeah, the previous version of Too Sexy just wouldn't run because of entity framework not being compatible. So that was a lot of work under the hood. And then the type safe stuff, which I'm going to be showing, that of course was a huge amount of work. I would say around 200 hours or more. So that's been keeping me super busy. But we think we've nailed it now. So I'm really looking forward to showing you guys that.
So are the rumors true, Daniel, that you are just a beast of a coder and you're just like cranking this stuff out mostly by yourself? Is that true? I know Tonchi helps out some here and there, but is it mainly you?
Let's say so there's 3 people working almost full time, and that's Donchi, his son Duye, and me.
Okay.
and I'm working, let's say, my night shift on this one. Yeah. So I probably get 20 to 40 hours a week on Too Sexy.
Nice. Wow, that's
I
that's
mean,
a lot. When do you have time to do the real business, right?
yeah. So actually, one of the things that I mean, to be honest, I mean, I think most of us got into the business because we love programming or something like that. And basically, when the company was a little smaller, we were like 6, 7 persons. I ended up just spending all my time just coordinating stuff and telling people what to do, and that really sucked.
Yeah.
So I was like, I have to grow this company to a size where I can do coding again, which had been my goal then. So I achieved that. Unfortunately, I guess my work-life balance isn't quite ideal. Um, so
But I'm sure you work with it though. You seem to get out. You just said you came back from a holiday, right?
yeah, yeah.
That's
So
good.
of course, Switzerland has 5 weeks of vacation, but since my wife is a teacher, she has 13 weeks of vacation. So let's say I get at least 10 weeks a year as well, just so that compensates for some of that.
Oh, that's
And
good.
so we just had a brief cruise to Norway and Denmark and stuff like that, just as a short summer hop.
That's great. One of the things that is like one of the first bullet points here was about the FIPS compliance too. And I know it doesn't apply to a lot of people though. For any of our government friends and things like that that do have those compliance requirements and so forth, there was a nice update to image flow, which is used within 2Sexy to be able to resolve those FIPS compliant issues. And to my knowledge, so far, that seems to be working. So until it doesn't, right? Until we find out something, but it should be good. So thank you for rolling that in. I know that's not a normal thing that most everybody deals with.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of FIPS until half a year ago. So
You know, I kind of was surprised when it actually happened because it seems like the maintainer of that platform, FIPS is evidently an older concept, that seems a bit irrelevant in today's age, but of course not in regulation side of things. So it is what it is. So I'm glad that was rolled in. Much appreciative there of that. I usually start out the meetup with a little bit of an overview of what 2Sexy is. I'm looking across the room and I see a couple of new names pop up. For those that don't know or have not experienced whatever, 2Sexy is really a content management system. But if you go out to 2sxc.org and you can leave off the language thing, it'll kind of detect what your language is and go out here, but you can learn a little bit more about it if it's something new to you and you're interested. It runs both on DNN as well as Octane, which if you're not familiar with Octane, it is a .NET Core based, Blazor based, I guess we would probably say, platform on running on ASP.NET Core. And feature parity is there between the two platforms, so you can install it as an extension on that and use it over there just as well. And for the most part, with some caveats to some deeper code stuff, you should be able to use the same templates and so forth on one versus the other, and it should be equivalent. So, and of course, if you don't know what DNN is, it's more of an application framework built on .NET framework, old school framework, so legacy framework. So a lot of people use that, running thousands and thousands and thousands of sites across the interwebs. So let me see here. Daniel, I think you just dropped a new blog today talking about what you're going to present here today. So good timing on that. Well, actually, no, that wasn't dropped today, was it? You just posted about it, I think, in one of the Facebook groups, I believe. Yeah. So won't steal the thunder there on that, but see if there's any other blogs since the last time. Yep, this is going over a little bit of the breaking changes from 16.1 to 16.2. And it seems like there were a few. I believe this one was dropped whenever we had our last meetup, so it should be caught up there on the blog side of things. Um, I guess it's probably a good time to just turn it over to Daniel. I mean, he's going to talk a little bit about some of these new, more hidden features or previously hidden features within here and some of the new capabilities. So, Daniel, I'm going to turn it over to you unless there's anything else that you'd like to highlight other than what you're going to present.
No, I think that's good.
Okay, great.
Let me just make sure I get this sharing right, the correct screen and all that. And let me see, is there a way to get all the people on my other screen or like on Teams, or is it just the
It's a
compact?
it's a preference in Zoom to be able to do multi-monitor, but I think you would actually have to log out and
Yeah,
rejoin
that's
in
fine.
order to do that.
Okay, so I try to get like the first, I'm going to show code very soon, but I figured just to get a quick overview of why we did this, I just prepared some notes which are on screen. It makes it a little easier if the video is watched later on again. Now I'm going to assume that everybody here has been doing something in 2Sexy. I'm going to be doing a little bit more technical stuff. If somebody is lost, feel free to ask a question. It's totally fine. I think the time's going to work out well anyways. So what we're looking at, of course, is basically, I want to give you guys an insight as to what we did, why we did it, and how it should make your life easier, right? Because 2Sexy's been like really dynamic ever since it started. I mean, basically when 2Sexy kind of started growing up in 2012, I mean, this is 10 years old already, right? We had ASP.NET and we had JavaScript, and JavaScript just felt much easier to write. And JavaScript was used for a lot of small stuff in those days. So its dynamic nature also felt very, very good. You could just write something and it would just work, right? Like as you can see here, you would do person.firstname or something, and it would just work in JavaScript. You wouldn't have to create a class first and all that. Now, the problem was, of course, that as JavaScript grew, they ended up realizing that this is not going to fly for big stuff because things just often break too late because you don't know if the property exists or not. It could be misspelled or whatever. And that's when TypeScript came. And I would say almost everything that's done in JavaScript nowadays, if it's anything enterprising, it's probably done in TypeScript because the dynamic capabilities just has too many downsides compared to the advantages of it. And in 2Sexy, that was kind of the idea in those days. It was like just to make things very easy, just very lightweight. And you'd basically just have HTML and some placeholders, and that felt good. Now, as we started to make more sophisticated things, then of course we started having real code blocks in there, things that were just a little bit more than placeholders. And that's also when things got more sophisticated and we started running into all kinds of challenges, which many of you probably didn't feel directly, but you probably ended up having to just copy paste something to get it to work because you didn't quite figure out why it did what it did. I'm sure that's an experience most of you have had because I can see it even in my team. They will often just copy something from another application because they can't just figure out how to do it. And it ended up to like a lot of magic happening in the background. And if people did mess up something, it became very difficult to kind of see what the problem was. Of course, I mean, I had a lot of insights and I would usually be able to spot the problem within minutes. But for other people, it would get much more challenging. And like point number 4, I mean, I even saw that in code in our company. People would copy paste something. The variable name would be from the source. It wouldn't be what's in that name, but basically you'd read the code and you wouldn't really know what's happening and everything was just confusing. And the compiler couldn't catch the problem because everything was dynamic. Okay. Now, just to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing, dynamic in terms of C# basically just means that I can have an object like a person and I can say dot and write anything behind it and it will just compile, right? It doesn't matter whether that will work or not. The compiler ignores it all the way. And that's what the magic of dynamic is that the compiler ignores it and at runtime, it's going to figure out what this is and it's going to resolve it. But of course, if you make any mistake, it cannot resolve it. So that's when it'll break at runtime. And what will often happen is you'll code something and it will work for you because the way you just built your test setup, those variables existed. But maybe the next person comes along and makes a change. It doesn't break, because one of the magic things we did in 2sexy is if you did person dot something something, it would still just return a null to kind of throw less errors. So we kind of wanted to make sure this thing is like not throwing a lot of errors. And so your code would just have an empty value there. The HTML would be produced, but you wouldn't see that you were actually mistyping something. So yeah, mistyping something is a common problem, was always a problem in JavaScript, also became a problem in 2sexy. Then type unsafety also added some problems. Here's a simple example, like if person dot is boss, right? That's something that should work in C#, but for various reasons, the is boss could be null in 2sexy, which meant you always had to write things like if is boss equals true to be really sure it's going to work. And if you didn't, it probably worked while you were developing it, but then later on it would run into a problem and you'd have to add that, and people would have a hard time realizing that they would have to do that. It's just one of those quirks that were a result of this. Then as things got more sophisticated, we wanted to use LinkU, and that was also really hard to use because, so I'm not sure how deep people are into development, right? But LinkU is where you have an object, a list of things, and you just say .where, and then you say is male equals something, or where first name equals something, and you can do all kinds of cool things. But LinkU are always extension methods, okay? That means the compiler kind of gets them from elsewhere and pretends like they really exist. It's a lot of magic again happening, but for that to work, it needs to know what this object is. For that too, we added some things to make it easier, but at the end of the day, it was always a problem because you would run into scenarios where if you didn't know about all this magic, it would get really hard to fix. Numbers were also a common problem. 2sexy always stores a decimal number, and so if you did calculations or something, you might be surprised that you would get fractions. Because people were expecting it to be an int. So this is like some background stuff, and basically why it happens is simply because the compiler doesn't know what's inside those variables. And that felt good in 2012. It doesn't feel good anymore once you start making bigger things. So for example, you can see this weird as list, person, boss, as object. This is kind of stuff you ended up doing in 2sexy so far just because it didn't know. Whoop, let me go back there. That boss is a certain type of a thing. With the new setup, it'll know it, so it doesn't need all this additional hacky workarounds. Okay? Yeah, LinkU I just mentioned. So far, again, I understand this is all fairly sophisticated. So if you're overwhelmed, just close your eyes for another 5 minutes and then we'll start looking at some code. One of the things people don't understand, by the way, is that dynamic variables have a really wide-reaching effect. So if you look at the next line here, which says variable title is, and here's a ternary expression, basically it's saying if it's male, title should have the word sir inside it, and if it's not, it should have madam inside it, okay? Now, to anybody that looks at this code, it's very obvious the title is going to be a string, but it's not. The reason is that the compiler, as soon as any part of the expression is dynamic, has to assume some things could happen or will happen or whatever. So the compiler is always going to assume results of this are also going to be dynamic. And that's why even one single dynamic property or variable in your code can have an effect much later on, which you don't expect, that it doesn't know what it is. And again, one of the things that I just felt is happening is people ended up running into these weird problems that they didn't understand. They would look for somebody who'd kind of fixed it, like that equals true. They would just copy it, but they would have no clue why it would work, and they would move on. And that's, of course, not how we would like to be developing. So the solution, just like with TypeScript, was to go strict on it. And it wasn't possible to just say all the existing code is now going to suddenly be strict, because if we did that, everything would break. So basically what we did is we created a new wrapper. So even before in Razor, you'd always have that dynamic entity wrapper. which gave you all that API. This one's called an I-typed item. It has a few normal properties like ID, GUI, title. Minor side note here, because this could be a caveat, something you'd run into. Previously, they were entity ID, entity GUID, entity title, but we just figured it's just nicer. There is still a .din property. We'll see that in a moment. For people who just still want to write lousy code and just want the code to look nicer, if you're just outputting values, it doesn't really matter. So we don't recommend its use very widely, but we're probably still going to make some samples like the content app, which is probably meant for, let's say, not so techie people that just want to have quick placeholders, right? If you just want to work with placeholders, you can still do item.din.firstname, and that will still magically work. But for everything else, you should be typically using the .string, .int, or whatever, which will get you a typed value as you need it. And that way the compiler knows exactly what it is. And it feels a little clunkier at first, but it's so much nicer to have the compiler tell you something's wrong than to find out later on. There's also, by the way, a get and a get with a type. But note that the get with a type has squiggly bracket, has pointy brackets, right? So at first we were thinking we'll just use that get pointy brackets string, for example. But the problem with that is that Razor will not figure that out. It will think here's an HTML tag, and that would break. So typically you'll be using .string, .int, and all that. And let me just quickly show you the docs page for this, because let me zoom in a bit just so you guys see it. So the I-typed item has all these methods like long, float, decimal, double, and some nice ones too, like URL or attribute, which we're going to be looking at in a moment. But so basically, most of these properties are just, they do exactly what you would expect them to do. So any questions so far? We're going to be looking at code in 3 minutes. Okay, none so far, so I'll keep going. What we also wanted to clean up at the same time is we've realized people have a hard time with the variable called content. And the reason was that in TooSexy, there's a variable called content. There's the content app. And this would already cause some confusion that people would just be thinking, this is the same thing, or is it not the same thing? Can I use this here? Can I not? So we wanted to make much clearer names going forward. So we're calling the main item, my item, and my header, and my data. Previously, it was just called data, but that too was kind of hard to figure out what that actually meant. You know, is this all the data of the system? Is this, what is it? So we're calling that my data. And there's the my model. We're going to look at that in a moment when we look at some real code. So my goal now is just to look at some real code with you guys and basically just walk through it as we look at this. So here is, I think I should probably zoom in a bit, right? This is typically otherwise too small on a remote screen. And I do have it open somewhere. Probably here behind the Zoom. Yes. So let me go to a fairly simple example on the blog app. This has already been published. So this code that we're going to walk through here, this is actually already available. You can just look at it. All our other apps are already prepared as well. But because I was on vacation, we haven't published them yet. But we will release them within the next 2 weeks. All of them now using the typed APIs. So let's look at this details page, which would be this one here. And is the size okay for everybody? Or should I zoom in some more? Okay, good.
Yeah, it looks pretty good.
So first thing, of course, what you'll see here is that it inherits Razor Pro. Previously, we'd have like Razor 14 or something. But we wanted to make sure people really realize there's a different convention here. So we didn't just call it Razor 16. It's also because we're not yet 100% sure if the dynamic model is still going to get an upgrade sometime. And it would be confusing if there was a Razor 16, which is typed, and then a Razor 17, which was not typed. So we wanted to make sure we gave it a clear naming. And as you can see here now, the syntax is, a lot of it is similar to what you've seen before. So we have this as item. Previously, you would have had as dynamic. So it's kind of similar, but the naming is different. But the compiler now gets a strictly typed object. It knows exactly what post can do and what it can't do. So if later on we do something, like, for example, we do post.html, the compiler really knows that this is possible. Or post.children, it knows that it can do this. So this is like the first line already, which shows things are getting different. Then the next code line, for example, is also different already, this get code here. Previously, this was called create instance. Again, it basically does the same thing, but we just felt like the naming, as it had grown within these 10 years, was just confusing people. It kind of made sense 8 years ago or wherever when we introduced this, but it just wasn't nice. So get code, and it will get the helper here. We'll look at that in one moment. And then here's some stuff that's very common to how you've seen it. But here's now, again, one which is one of the new ones, like app.resources.string. So the system really knows this is a string. I could, if I wanted to, by the way, still write .din and then just .this. I could do this as well. This would also work. Okay, we just don't recommend it. But again, if we're just outputting it to HTML, it doesn't really matter. In those scenarios, the impact is really not relevant. But for our sample apps, we plan on keeping everything very clear. So we try to recommend best practices. And so we're sticking to this pattern here. Here we're calling a function from the other code here, so we don't have to look at that. I'm going to skip a little bit of stuff here. Here we're also calling another function from externally. But then other things look the same as before. Here's a toolbar that's going to create a toolbar for the post. So that is this button here, which will appear. So that is basically the same. We're calling another CSHTML file, passing in data and everything. And I'm going to look at this one with you right now, because here's another typical problem where dynamic kind of interferes. When you call another Razor, you will give it data. And of course, this thing here is very loosely typed. It could contain anything. And so our challenge was, how do we make sure that when we pass the data to the subfile, that it still gets it in typed? And that's why let's go look at this authors, date, and categories. For your understanding, this is this little block here. So what we did is we created a new handover object, which is called my model. It's also using the my convention. This is anything that has my in front of it is like specific to this instance. And I mean, you know, from like other, like if you would just be creating a Blazor system, you could create strictly typed models, but this doesn't make sense here. We don't know what it is. But what you do now is you just say, okay, I'm expecting an item on the name post, and now the compiler also knows this is strictly typed. So this way, the handover into other Razor files is also strictly typed. So we can then do these things here, and everything is still strictly typed. Remember, if just one thing were dynamic in this chain, like if blog posts were dynamic, then author would be dynamic, and then author name would be dynamic, right? This is the viral part of the dynamic code. But this way, the handover is strictly typed. So blog post is strictly typed, and everything just works as expected again. Make sense so far? Some people nodding their heads. You'll just have to get your hands dirty, by the way, to play with this, and you'll also see things popping up. So if we keep on going with this, we have, let's say, HTML. Oh, and I'd like to show you one new feature, by the way. Let's just pretend I didn't remember that this was as item, and I would say as dynamic. Okay? This command does not exist on Razor Pro, because we really wanted to make sure people don't start mixing paradigms. just because they copy pasted something from a previous source, right? So as dynamic won't work. I'm going to save this now. And if I now load this page, of course, it's going to complain. So it's going to say, blah, blah, the name as dynamic doesn't work, blah, blah, blah. And what we also added, for example, nowadays, if you run into a problem, you'll immediately get a button to open the insights. That's just 12 clicks less to get to insights.
That's amazing. I like that.
So that's one simple example. And let's say I made a different mistake. For example, I said var x equals content, because again, the variable content doesn't exist anymore. Then it would also tell you that this is not good, okay? But it's even going to give you a specific help saying, okay, you're probably calling content, it's not supported, probably better this. So we've introduced an error capturing system which should get most of the typical problems you could run into, and thereby guide you to make these things right. Because otherwise, we're pretty sure people would get frustrated when they do copy paste their previous code and it just doesn't work anymore. So that's just that error catching system, again, was at least 2 weeks of work. But we believe it's going to just make sure people do things better. And it'll also just remove the frustration threshold, which people get when they just type stuff and it just doesn't work. I'm going to assume a lot of people had that from time to time, and that's why.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, sometimes it feels like you're coding in the dark or blind. You just unless you know what you know, or if you're trying something new and you don't really know how it works, that can get you in trouble really quick.
Yeah. So that was my impression. So that's why it was important to us. And here, for example, we can now see some simple things. Now we're just going to say, okay, I have these children, and tags is strictly typed, so I can just do tags.any. I can do tags.count, and it just works. I'll quickly try to see if I can show you what this code would have been like previously. This is the version 5. The structure could be a bit different. Let me see if I have the tags here. Yeah, so here's a typical example of how things were a little bit more magical before, right? So I had to do as list, and then I had to again say, but by the way, tags is an object. If I didn't do this, it would have failed before. So even this would have failed, and tags.any would have failed anyhow. And then count kind of magically worked, but if you wrote brackets, you could run into problems. There was all this little stuff that just caused more challenges than necessary. So this is just now strictly typed. If you read it, I think you're not going to feel much different to what you read before. If you type it, you are going to be frustrated a few times because some habits will interfere with the cleaner setup. But otherwise, it's just lightweight. Like here, we're just going to get the author. We just want one. So with the tags, we wanted all of them. With the author, we just want one. This just works. Another thing I'd like to point out, this has also been something we've just wanted to improve. We have a field called image, and sometimes, in most cases, you want the link to it. And then you do .url. Because the value is actually something like file 72. So if you would do .string, you're going to get file 72. If you do .url, you're going to get the link. So could cause some confusions as we were refactoring it. Things got a bit more difficult. But you'll get used to it. And in most cases, you'll want the URL, of course, because that's just as expected. So that's this part here. Let me see what else I would like to show you. Let me see if I have any Atom in use. Nope. let me quickly check my... Let me first undo the stuff I did here, because of course this could get confusing otherwise. As Atom, you guys know the as Atom, right? That's basically to say this field could have a file in it, or it could have a folder in it or something. And so previously you would do this as Atom and tell it this is what you want. This is now different. So I'm gonna, to demonstrate this, I'm gonna open up the gallery app here. Okay. So instead of using as Atom and then giving it the object and the field name, this is now directly part of the syntax. So you would go like that. And again, it's strictly typed because the compiler knows this. It'll just make the code more readable and easier to understand. So small things, but they should make your life easier. Let me see what else I'd like to show you. Okay, documentation. Just a small thing here. Here's the I typed item, right? I do hope you guys know how to get to the docs.toosexy.org. And whenever you get to the .NET API, you always have the most important namespaces right here. And so, of course, if you want to look at the I typed item, then you can see, okay, it has this thing, it has a child, it has a children, the field. I believe the way it's made now, it's very, very easy to understand as opposed to previously. And we're probably also not going to update the previous documentation a lot more anymore, because this is the way we think it should be going. And this is just much clearer. And as you can see, you have the children, you have the parents. And this is a new one. By the way, this doesn't exist in 16.02 yet. But we'll also add a .picture method to the item, just because those are the most common things you want to do. You want to output rich text, you want to output a picture, and it's just convenient that way. But what we also did is, it's hard to show how it was before, but previously, if you would have clicked on API 14, this page would have been only like 2 screens long, because it would say, oh, it just inherits this and this and this, and you'd have to start figuring out what that actually means. And we completely changed our paradigm here. We're going to composition over inheritance. Do you guys know what that means? Anybody volunteering?
Totally.
So I just heard
together with dependency injection?
No, just
Not yet. Just okay.
Want to say something briefly so I don't talk all the time? Or does anybody want to chime in? Composition over inheritance?
Daniel, I think he was asking you if you wanted to explain it.
Oh, basically, so if you want to reuse something of another class, instead of inheriting from it, you basically consume it. And in a perfect world, you would use dependency injection or depend on an interface. So I don't know how far you went with this, but the base idea is that to avoid inheriting in order to use something else.
Yeah. So I guess as object-oriented programmers, we've been inheriting objects for a long time already. But that introduces a lot of problems. Like, we cannot inherit from something that is injected, right? It's not possible. And you end up having problems where you inherit from something and you inherit again and you inherit again. And then suddenly you want to remove some of the properties of the objects that you were inheriting from. And that doesn't work. So inheriting is kind of cool. And it's great if you know exactly what you're doing and you have a controlled environment. But with time, it actually becomes a burden in a lot of scenarios. So what we did is actually we changed most of our things. Like previously, this inheritance structure would have been about 3 levels deeper. But we're not doing that anymore because like API 14 has certain methods like as dynamic, which we just could not inherit for API Pro. it should not have an as dynamic. So what we did is we changed the paradigm completely. These objects are now not inheriting all the functionality anymore. They're actually a naked object, which adds the stuff as the interface expects it to. And thereby, a very neat side effect was that actually the stuff is way, way more documented. So if you now go to the Razor Pro class, instead of having just 2 pages, everything saying, by the way, this is documented elsewhere, we can now have very rich documentation of everything that we've documented. And you see all the properties in a clean list, like you have the my context, the my data, the my header, the my item. So we still need a little bit of time to text this stuff. But before, it was really hard to see what these objects actually had on them, which led to that guesswork and copy pasting again. And now the stuff is really just there, right? So for example, we just noticed that people used the user object a lot because they needed to check, is it a super user? Should I do like show some extra buttons for the admin? And so we figured, okay, let's add it. We just added the my user. But before, you would have had a hard time finding it because the documentation would kind of have this inheritance structure and you wouldn't really notice that it's there. And now you have a clean list of all the properties that you care about, and you can work your way through it that way. Another thing we did, by the way, this one might trip you, is we had a property called settings and a property called resources. And there's also the app settings and the app resources, but people would have a hard time realizing their differences and that they are actually different. So again, we tried to introduce a much clearer naming schema. So all resources, all settings, it's all just not quite as short anymore as it used to be, but we hope it's much more expressive and clear as to what these things do. Also, that's why everything has a my in front of it if it's just meant for this use. So that was some demoing. Any questions so far, or something somebody would like to see? Maybe something they tripped over and been burnt with and would like to see how would that be done nowadays?
You have to see the chat for Jeremy's awesome question there.
Oh, okay. Let me see. I'm not even sure if I can. I know it's somewhere. Okay, there's not a question here, right? But it's very friendly.
No. It's funny. For those that are watching after the fact, he says, is there an award for the most informationally dense data table in history? No. And it's going to app-dev.toosexy.org.
Cool. Thank you. We have a cool trick in here, by the way. So for example, if you hit this button, it'll copy paste the path to the Visual Studio repo. So I can just copy this and hit WinR, paste, enter, and then
of course you have a shortcut for it. That's awesome.
And actually what you guys probably don't know is there's about 300 tests running on this. They don't run by default, but if I hit this, it's going to take about a minute, and it's going to scan all the C# files, all the README files, all the CSHTML files for any common mistakes that are typically made. And so when we introduce a new version of TooSexy and we're like saying, okay, as dynamic is bad, then we say, okay, the apps in this block should adhere to this new convention, and then it'll flag everything that still uses those things that we're trying to get rid of.
So Daniel, random question. Is the app for this published anywhere?
So of course it's on GitHub. I'm not sure if it's public. I don't have a reason to keep it secret, but I think people would be fairly overwhelmed.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
Right, because here's the set. Oh, no, that's the wrong one. I have
it's impressive though. I mean, it really
I have a few of these insane apps.
It would be really disappointing if it wasn't written in TooSexy.
I mean, I could see, obviously there's a lot of,
so here are my
custom stuff here, but I could see this being very inspirational for people.
You see, here's, for example, trying to catch all kinds of use cases where the old settings variable was being used, right? And then it'll create a bunch of warnings, and then you'd know what to go clean up. Because otherwise, we have all these templates, right? And if we did something and we really wanted to make sure because I know even my employee copy pastes code from our apps. So if the templates were not really pristine, they would start copying old stuff and yeah, stuff. So this has a lot of love in it. Yeah.
And they think they're doing the right thing because they're saying, what would Daniel do?
Yeah. Okay, so that's kind of where we are. Is there anything else I'd like to show? So, I mean, at the end of the day, the idea is it still does what it did before. And a lot of the syntax is similar, but it's not the same. So that's going to take some effort to work your way into. By the way, what I've also been working on, and this is like always the nasty thing, right? You create a new solution, and then basically you need so much time to document it, to create tutorials, or to create samples. But what I'm working on here, you guys can hopefully still see my screen, is a quick reference. So this is on the live site, by the way, where, I mean, like the basic Razor syntax, that is the same as the previous one, but here just working with the current item, showing examples as a quick reference, how to get certain information. And yeah, it's unfortunately by far not there yet, but yeah, here working with the mypage.parameters, stuff like that. Because again, I see people, I produce so much content and people still don't know what is there because they don't have time to read everything, right? And I'm hoping now this quick reference might help a little bit.
That's fabulous. We had the same effort here. I started compiling a list of here's the 2 or 3 old ways and here's the new way that you should do it.
Okay.
And, didn't get very far, just about 6 or 7 things, but there were a lot of stuff. Either me or the staff were just doing things the old way and we didn't know it sometimes. So you kind of need those reminders. This looks excellent.
Yep.
Is this live yet?
So this is live. Again, it's very incomplete, right? At the moment, I think I got down through the basic chapter and typically, see, that's you guys might have remembered or noticed in version 16.02, I said we had to make a breaking change to the 16.01. And that was because, I mean, we'd already figured out how to make the typed system, but it just wasn't good enough yet. We were mixing it into the normal too sexy stuff. And as we were migrating our apps and creating the tutorials, we realized how confusing things can get if people actually can mix these paradigms, because they'll feel like they're getting everything cleaned up, when in reality, it was still just as dynamic as it was before. They just didn't know it. And yeah, so typically I'll be documenting something and trying something and migrating some code, and then I'll be like, oh my goodness, I have to start all over again. And that's what happened here, unfortunately. So yeah, so this is live. Again, and I'm trying to also have a quick reference for the old one as well. The new one is going to be more important, but I haven't gotten far enough yet as I would like to. But the basic idea is like you work with the current item, you see the output, you see the source code, and there's links to other tutorials which will go deeper in regards to this subject. So the idea is to have one single page with just about everything in compact form, and then let people go deeper when they realize that they actually need this. Yeah, David, you're right about that one. So yeah, so we were trying to figure out what to call it, like typed or something. We just figured is a little cumbersome and people could misunderstand. But you're absolutely right. The pro, we did stumble on that, and that's one of the 2 hard problems, right? Naming.
Yeah, absolutely. I finally figured out, I was like, oh no, this is really just more pro feature, like as a pro, you would expect this kind of thing there. Finally figured it out. But at first I was like, I don't understand why type safe stuff is going to be a paid for feature.
Yeah.
So I thought it was going to be part of the patron program, but now I finally figured it out. But yeah.
Yeah, so that's probably a good one, and probably something I wouldn't even know how to communicate it to the community. But yeah, no, this is not paid for. This is just if you're a crack, this is what you want to be using, because you want to do things in a robust way.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, hopefully it'll make more sense being in context to the other documentation and things like that too. So
yeah. So just another brief roundup of other features, right? The docs are way better. There's the .url versus .string, for example. There's also a .attribute property method that, let me quickly check if I'm using it anywhere in the blog. Yes, I am. Right. For example, here I have, can you see my screen, guys?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I have an attribute and I need to put the name in it. And as everybody knows, things can go south that way. Because of course, most of the time it won't, but it could. So there's a new method called .attribute, which will of course get that value, but it will do some HTML cleanup. It doesn't remove the HTML tags, but it would encode them and stuff like that, just making sure this is not going to break an attribute. So that's another goodie. The .html, I'm not sure if you guys have used that before. Have you guys used the .html so far? Not yet. So the .html does a lot of magic. Let me show it on the blog post. So I'm going to close the tutorial here again so that I don't get overwhelmed with all my open browser tabs. Let me see, this should be working again. Okay, so the .html does a lot of things. On one hand, it takes care of inner content. Okay, inner content used to be a bit tricky. So if you have inner content in your HTML, it's gonna just do that for you. But what it also does is, I mean, here I have a blog post, right? And it has pictures in it and everything. And here I'm using the new rich mode, which allows me to be much more explicit as to how picture should behave or how separator should work. So let me just F12 this and do some resizing. And as you can see now, the picture now is on its own line and not beside the stuff anymore. But to do that, you need to get a few magic things done. So the WYSIWYG knows about it, but the HTML knows about it too. And let me now flush it, because remember, these are actually now in WYSIWYG images. Previously, if you had pictures in the WYSIWYG, they were not responsive. So they were not going to have other resolutions for bigger screens because it just outputted the HTML. But with this new setup, if I now increase the size of a screen, bam, you get a larger image now. And of course, it knows that my browser knows WebP, so it's going to deliver them as WebP. If I go bigger, I got a bigger size as well. Yeah. So the .html, which is basically just this line here, does a lot. It will look up what are my rules for WYSIWYG images for the resizing. It's going to check, is the information there that I can resize them? And it's going to create picture tags instead of the IMG tag that the HTML editor creates, and more. It's also going to create an optimized toolbar, this one here, where when you hit edit, you get this Zen mode with just this text and not all the other buttons that you would otherwise have in the, the normal edit will have a lot more, right? Making it a little bit unsexy to then scroll down to the right position where you actually have the stuff you want to be working on. And so the .html does optimized toolbars with Zen mode. It does image responsiveness and a lot of other stuff too. So do check that out. That was already in version 16.0, but again, it's one of those things that people don't see it, like in the new blog app, they would have no chance of figuring it out. As Atom has been replaced.
So does this kind of, trying to wrap my head around it, does this kind of replacing what we old school would have done, HTML.raw, and then put the field in it and expect it to kind of clean up some stuff, but obviously these other things don't work. So this is a better way to go about it now, right?
So this is HTML.raw specifically for WYSIWYG fields that should be responsive.
Okay.
Right, because for the whole thing to work, let me just do a sleight of hand here. So I just activated some debug CSS, which will show me the behavior of the output, right? Because again, responsive stuff gets tricky as well, right? So on the .html, you can say debug true, and it will actually add some stuff so that you can actually see where the placeholders are, where the splitters are and everything, so that you have an easier time as you're resizing it to figure out what's actually happening. Why is this resizing the way you want, right? Because a common thing, for example, is if pictures are aligned right or left, you need a gap just to get that right, and all that stuff. Yeah, so the HTML.raw does, so it's basically HTML.raw specifically for large WYSIWYG blocks that are meant to have pictures. Because here, for example, we have 3 pictures side by side. And again, the editor shouldn't have to know about all the difficulties of doing that, right? So the editor here just picked these pictures and said they were aligned left and width 33%. And now the magic has to make sure the padding is as expected and all that. So yeah, it's a lot of work.
Daniel, I think you need to start, like, whenever you're working on one of the apps that is a public, app, I think you need to, like, just start selling tickets for a Zoom that people can join and just watch you code. Because, like, seems like every time you show something, I'm like, oh, I didn't know you could do that. Oh, I didn't know you could do that. Oh, I didn't know you could do that. That would be great.
Yeah, so actually I sometimes do consulting for companies when they're like usually onboarding too sexy. And then we usually have a complete script going through everything. But yeah, that's usually like 4 to 8 workshops spread across 2 months or something. Because yes, if you know all the goodies, you can be so much more efficient and effective because it takes care of so much of your problems. So we discussed all of these goodies and 1 or 2 traps. The my data, for example, is something you can run into. Again, if you do that, you'll get a nice warning. One very special trap, which maybe not everybody will understand on this call, and that's totally fine, is the my item is not necessarily the same thing as the first item in my data. Okay. So let me try to explain this. I'm going to go back to the blog app, and just to get to the admin view, I'm going to go back 1 page. And is there a way to make this thing go away? I have a hard time. How do I hide this? Can I slide it out of the way?
Are you talking about the Zoom toolbar?
Yeah, can I make it like...
Control-Alt-Shift-H.
Yep.
Whoa. That's like too sexy with Control-Alt-Shift-Click.
Yep. That way you can remember it.
And then you can just hit escape to get it back.
Or the same shortcut, right?
Yeah, or the same shortcut.
I didn't even know about escape to bring it back. Cool.
I mean, if I'm here, it does actually work. So I was on the browser and I hit it and wow.
Yep.
Okay, so I learned something too.
It's the first thing I do right after joining any meeting.
Yep.
Okay, so the details view in this case, of course, gets its data from a query. That's kind of obvious, right? And yes, the query is a little bit complicated because it needs to make sure that only the right people can see data that's not published yet and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, it's going to replace the default item with the latest blog post. Okay, that's kind of what we expect. Now, previously, in the non-pro version, the content object was that object. Okay, so the content object was this blog post. But that caused some new problems because sometimes, let me go back to this view, to let's say the home view. Sometimes I would have a module which would have its own entity to configure what it does. And maybe it would have a title or something. And that was on the content object if you did not have a query. Do you guys know what I'm saying? So normally the main content was on content, and once you added a query, it might have been on content. It depended on what your query did. But it just made it a little bit more confusing if you ever needed that content in addition to what the query was giving you. So as soon as you used a query, it kind of got hard to access this information again. And that's why we decided, as we refactored this, that this information is always the my item. The my item doesn't get replaced by the query. The query puts data in my data. And if you don't have a query, then they're actually the same thing. Because there's the default query, which just gets data for this module. But this way, you have to be more explicit that you're actually getting the blog post from the my data, because if I did this, this would not have the expected result. So if you understood what I said, way to go. If you didn't, it probably doesn't matter yet, but when you do end up running into something where it's confusing, just check this out again. Or was somebody so confused and saying, wait a second, this is a no-go, maybe you should rethink this again? Then you can still say it, because it's not widely used yet, so that I could still change it, but I felt that this was an important difference to make.
We normally did stuff like that by assigning it as a header item and then putting whatever we want as a content type on that and adding the settings there. It's interesting to see it done this way instead.
Yeah, same here. That's what I was trying to wrap my head around. It's kind of a different way of thinking.
Can you say that again? Just didn't quite get that.
Well, we would put the same information, the title and some settings, technically settings for the module. We would put it in the header item.
Mm-hmm.
And we'd add, and sometimes we even got lazy and just assigned that item as one of the content types, or we made a custom content type for it. But anyhow, that's where we would put these settings. So I just find it interesting that your thinking is separated in code so that the my item, the old content item, always comes as is, and you can put that stuff there while still having your list of data be separate. Anyhow, it's just interesting. I got to get my head around it. I'm not even sure I said what I think I mean correctly.
Yeah.
I think I was thinking the same thing there, Jeremy.
Yeah. Let me quickly think. I'm just going to quickly look if I can think of a case where I believe the FAQ app would be a good demo, because this might not have that changed yet. But here's a typical example where, I mean, basically this data should come from a query. Let me quickly verify that this is the case, right? We have a query getting the stuff. And one of the magic things you could do now in this FAQ app was that you could say which categories should be available, right? You might make an FAQ for only the media questions or something, okay? Now, in this specific case, the query had to get that data here, kind of getting the module information, and then use that as a parameter to get the categories and to do some sorting and stuff like that, because there was the ability to specify the sorting order as well. So it needed this information in the query, okay? Now, but this information was never passed on to the view anymore in this specific case, because I guess it wasn't needed anymore. But if you would have needed it, I would have had to make another connection going from here and saying, okay, I'm going to put this on header or whatever to make that still available in the Razor template. And in the new mode, I don't need to, because data will get me the questions, but my item will still get me this one, or my header for that matter. But yeah, I'll have to try to wrap my head around on how other people are using it and yeah, possibly find ways to give better guidance as well. Okay, let's take out that debug mode. Okay, we're good to go. Anything else left to share? So what's next? So in 1602, by the way, the typed objects are, of course, typed, but you were still able to do my item.string bad field, and it would just return a null. In 1603, we're going to make sure that that will throw an error unless you'd want to allow that. because again, typos are so easy to make. And there are cases where you want to be very dynamic, and so it's still possible. But by default, it's going to say this is not what you should be doing, and you can either do this or this or this, and then you'll be able to figure it out. What we're also going to add is the dot picture, because I believe that's one of the most used helper commands. Very nice. And there's a lot of stuff already in the commits, which we hope to release probably next week.
Where is the strict mode setting going to end up being? Is it going to be in app settings, or you're going to do it as a line in code?
It's just your namespace, I think you're using in the code, right?
Yeah, basically the goal is that you see this as item, right? And you would then be able to say something like strict false, well, yeah, like that. And then this object would allow you to be unstrict.
Okay.
But again, my guess is 99% is going to prefer strict, and that's why strict true is going to be the default. But there are some cases where you might be getting different items. You might be getting a person that only has 5 properties and an extended person that has 12 properties. And in that case, you might not want to be strict about it, but still have the same I-typed item. And that's why those are like the edge cases where you might want to use that.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. We have person and we have person plus with other fields. So that's a good example.
Yeah, and then if your template sometimes uses this one and sometimes uses that one, then strict would be annoying.
Yeah, and I asked that question also just so you know, because 40% of the time I get lost trying to figure out where on earth in the settings stack something is.
Yeah.
So I'll complain about that in writing someday.
Yeah. The settings stack, by the way, is also, let me see if I have an example here.
The mark of a robust solution is when you get more complaints.
Okay, I can't talk about that right now, but yeah, so the setting stack is there's some improvements there as well, but you'll see it in the code samples. I think I'm almost done here, but that's about it.
Cool.
So I think we've just used up on my hour. We're overdue already. Any questions or things you guys would like to share before the day's over?
This is really good.
Just a lot of compliments and thanks. This looks fantastic. I can see this preventing a lot of rabbit holes we used to run down.
Cool.
Yeah, I could see this being very helpful. Of course, the longer you do this stuff, the more secondhand nature things become. So, we've gotten a lot of those kinks kind of worked out just naturally, but still being able to do this in a more complex scenario that you don't do all the time, that would be wonderful.
And I'll also very jokingly say, that's enough learning new stuff. Just stop for a little while, for God's sake.
I was going to say, David, I don't know how anything with too sexy becomes second nature, because I'm just running like hell to keep up. And there's always something new and really useful. I'm going, oh, Lord, here we go again. But
I don't remember on which channel, if it was Slack or Discord or something, but some developer was kind of really mad at something, and he commented like, I entered this business not to learn something new every day, and said, well, maybe you should switch businesses there.
Wrong business.
And at least as long as you're catching up to something that's useful, then I think that's still a good sign, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. Because at the end of the day, anytime I invest in learning something new that you guys have done or whatever, it does pay dividends, because it's like, okay, that really is easier, or it is better, or there's some benefit to it for the most part. So
yeah, cool.
Daniel, thanks for presenting this. This is exciting new stuff, and I'm glad to see it coming along. Any ideas on when an LTS mark might happen in the near future, or still kind of don't know?
An LTS, so can't say something specific at the moment. We feel like it's very stable. Yeah. But it's just for calling it an LTS, it needs to have been used in the wild for at least a few weeks, and people won't use it as much if we don't release the new apps yet, because they won't notice that. I mean, they don't know if they're using the new stuff, right? So I would just realistically expect this to take 2 months or something.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't hesitate to use it in production. We're using it in production.
Yeah, we are.
Yeah, we are too, but and mainly because of the problem with editing in the 16.1, you can't, in certain scenarios you couldn't, because of that bug, that was in there. That
Which
was
one?
the main reason. I'm trying to remember it off the top of my head now, but there was
a date picker.
There was something in the UI where when you clicked it, it just wouldn't work. You fixed it, but it was fixed in 16.2 instead of 16. Yeah. Something else. So that's the main driver for us going to there. But
yeah, and we're also trying to like not release too many LTSs because that will also get people nervous.
Yeah, exactly.
What's an LTS if everything's an LTS?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, everybody, for joining. We're going to end the meetup now, but hopefully this time frame works for most of you. If not, and there's better times, feel free to post in Slack or Discord. Let us know what's good for you. I don't know if we'll do a flip-flop thing. I'm kind of leaning towards letting it be consistent every month. If this, time frame works, then we'll try to do this as the first Wednesday of each month. And Daniel, I know you mentioned Wednesday is usually something special for you guys. So if there is a better day in the week that works good for you.
So Wednesday's fine as long as it's this time. If it would be an hour later, it would already be a problem.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, well, good. Well, we'll probably keep it at this time slot unless we hear otherwise. So please let your voice be heard if there's something different. We're never gonna please everybody with time slot, but I'm glad that you were able to join today, Daniel. It's really helpful to hear from you every once in a while. So it's great. Kudos. And if anybody's interested in chatting next month, let me know. But I think we'll be doing the I can't remember if next month, if our order is, we've gotten a little bit out of whack because of the skipping of last month. So I can't remember what format it is next month, but it won't be a presentation next month. It's either a show and tell or more of a, yep, can't remember the other format. Wow, drawing a complete blank. What was that?
I'm looking forward to the show and tell, so I hope that's next. I've got at least 3 lined up with some notes.
Cool.
Some
little 5-minute things.
That's great. All righty then. Well, have a great day, everybody. Thanks for joining, and have a good rest of your week.
Thanks. See you guys.
Thanks everyone.